So we've already reviewed the process of targeting DOM elements, or the objects that represent those DOM elements, and modifying the inner HTML property. And that will allow us to add in HTML in the DOM. In other words, we can create HTML elements. But this time I want to do it differently. I actually want to create an object in JavaScript that represents a DOM element that doesn't exist in the DOM. So I want to create an object in JavaScript first. I want to modify that object, and then I want to send that object off to the DOM compiler. And the DOM will take that information, process it, and it will print out a HTML element to the user. So I'm starting out with a blank HTML page. Now this HTML page has no elements, it has no CSS styles. Now what I could do to add elements, just like I did in the previous lecture, is use the inner HTML property. And then you can inject HTML and add in new elements. And I could do this very easily by targeting the body element. And you can do it by simply saying document.body. And this will print out an object to do with the body element, and it has inner HTML, and with that we have a string, and in there you could go ahead and inject HTML. So that's one way of adding in HTML, but there is another way of doing it. The other way of adding in DOM elements is to first create an object that resembles a DOM element in JavaScript. And then you can take that object and you can append it onto the DOM, which means take that object that resembles a DOM element, give it to the DOM compiler. It will then take that information, that element, and it will convert it into a HTML element and show it to the user. So what I want to do is create an object. How do we do this? Well, as I said, with an object, you need to be able to reference it at a later date. Otherwise, you're creating an anonymous object. So we need to create a variable to store this object. We need a box, a container, if you will, with a label on it to store an object so we can come back to it at a later date. So I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to say DOM object, and it's equal to document.createElement. So what this is doing is it's not going to again create like a HTML string, because we are in JavaScript. We know that JavaScript isn't working with sort of an XML type string with the tag name and attributes. That's for the DOM. But JavaScript works with its own objects, its own version of the DOM. This is called the virtual DOM, the object representation in JavaScript of the DOM. So that's the name for it. It's called the virtual DOM. So we are creating a virtual DOM element right here. It's not a HTML element in and of itself. It's just going to create an object that resembles a DOM element. Now, this method requires you to pass in one parameter, and that is the name of the element you want to create. So what would you like to create? A div element, a video element, any sort of semantic HTML5 element such as header, footer, section, and so forth? You have all of these available to you, but all I'm going to do is create a simple div element. So when I run that command, it will create a global variable. It will assign a value to that variable, and whatever is returned from the createElement method will be stored within that object. And what will be created? Well, let's take a look. Let's say DOM object, and you'll notice we have a div element. As I said, it may look like HTML, but that's because the console is taking it easy on us. What it is actually producing is a JavaScript object that resembles a div element. And there's all of the different properties and events and all the rest of it that we can attach onto this DOM element. So at the moment, if we were to append this element to the DOM, it would be an empty div tag and it wouldn't have any styles or anything associated with it. So let's go ahead and sort of modify this DOM object right here and just add a bit of personality to this element. So first of all, I'm going to target the DOM object. And then let's go ahead and give it an ID. We're going to assign an ID. So we target the ID property and then we say my div. Next up, we can go ahead and start adding in some styles right here. So I'll say style.width. So again, we're modifying the style attribute and we're inserting a width CSS property. And again, because it takes a measurement such as pixels, EMs, and so forth, it needs to be a string. So I'm going to say the width is going to be 100 pixels. The height is also going to be 100 pixels. And let's have a background color of green. So we've started this up, we've given it an ID. And also, one final thing, let's target the DOM object, and I just want to add in some inner text and just say this is my div. So now we have added an ID, added 3 CSS properties, which is the width, height, and background, and added some inner text to this DOM element. Let's take a look at the DOM element now. So again, I don't want to print out an interactive list. I just want to take a look at what the HTML looks like, so I can just call it. And now you'll notice it looks very, very different from this. We have an ID attribute, we have a style attribute with the 3 CSS properties, and we also have the text in there as well. So now that we've given this some personality, it's time to take this div element per se, this div object that is currently in JavaScript. So this one right here. We want to take the information from this object, give it to the DOM compiler and say, look, create me this element right here and add that in. Now it needs to know where to inject this particular DOM element. So what you need to do first of all is target where you want to append, let's say, your DOM element. Well, in my case, I only have the body element. So I'm going to say document.body. And then once we're targeting the body element, this element right here, we can then say .append child. So whenever you want to take an object that resembles a DOM element and you want to insert it into the DOM, you target the element that you are going to inject your new element into, and then you say append child, and finally you need to provide the variable name where your object is stored. So in my case, I then target the variable DOM object, and there we go. It went to the body, said, right, there's the body element. Aha. Append child, what child? The object within the DOM object variable. Also, it's this guy right here. Yeah, no problem. It passed out all of the information and it gave it to the DOM. So there we go. We have originally a virtual DOM element that is our div that was then taken and it was sent to the DOM. So now what I want to do is take a look at the console window, and I want to create a variable and give it a name. So I'll just say span element. And now what I'd like to do is create a new element. So again, you say document.createElement, and then we want to, let's say, create a span element. So now we have a span element right here. And again, this is virtual DOM, so it is a JavaScript object. So whenever we say virtual DOM, it just means a HTML object represented as a JavaScript object. Now, once we've done this, I want to just add in some text to this span element. So I'm going to say span element dot inner text, and I'm just going to say this is inner span. So when I hit return, we now have our span element with some inner text. Now what I want to do is take that span element and then go ahead and push it inside of this div element. Well, how do I do it? Well, we know that this div element has an ID of my div. So as we're working with the document or the virtual DOM, we need to say document.getElement by ID. So, aka look through all the virtual DOM elements, look through all those objects for an object with the ID property set to my div. Once we have this object, we can then say append child again, and then we need to say what element we want to append. Well, we want to append the span element right here. Hit return. And you'll notice this is the span inner, well, the inner span. And you'll notice it did actually add that span element in there. Now, please do note, if I was to just target that my div element and use .innerHTML and add in that span right there, it would have been a quicker process. So whenever you have simple little things like this, use innerHTML. It's a lot quicker. Now on top of that, we also have the same references to these objects. So we have our two variables, which is DOM object and span element. Those are our two virtual DOM objects in JavaScript. They are objects, but they print out in the console like HTML. But you'll notice when I hover over them that the browser is highlighting these elements, so the reference isn't lost. These objects right here are still there, and I can still modify those objects as well. So for example, let's go and grab the DOM object, and what we can do is change the style a bit, change the background color, and we'll change it to red. And there you go. So it targeted that div element, it changed the style, it changed the background CSS property, and it gave it the value of red. So the relationship was maintained between the virtual DOM and the actual DOM element. So there we go. That is how you create virtual DOM elements, or what we like to call JavaScript objects that represent DOM elements. And we have the DOM element itself being produced.